Welcome to Ukraine Echoes, the podcast brought to you by Heart of Europe, where we delve into the most pressing issues and pivotal moments shaping the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I'm your host, Connor Bendix, and today we have a gripping and eye-opening episode lined up for you. In this episode, we'll explore the recent diplomatic maneuvers by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, whose visits to both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Russian President Vladimir Putin have stirred significant controversy. Orbán's actions come at a crucial time, as Hungary assumes the rotating EU presidency, and his moves have been met with widespread criticism from European leaders. We'll discuss the implications of these visits, Orbán's controversial stance on Western military aid to Ukraine, and the potential impact on EU unity and support for Ukraine. Stay with us as we dive into this unfolding story's intricate details and far-reaching consequences. This is Ukraine Echoes, where we bring you the echoes of conflict, resilience, and hope from the heart of Europe. Let's get started. This week, the diplomatic landscape of Europe witnessed a notable development as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán embarked on a dual visit to Kiev and Moscow. In a series of high-stakes meetings, Orbán first met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy before traveling to Russia for talks with President Vladimir Putin. These visits, occurring shortly after Hungary assumed the rotating presidency of the European Union, have sparked intense debate and criticism, casting a spotlight on Orbán's controversial role within the EU. Orbán's trip to Ukraine marked his first visit since Russia's full-scale invasion began. During his meeting with President Zelenskyy, Orbán proposed a swift ceasefire to create an opportunity for peace talks between the warring nations. This proposal was met with immediate rejection from both Zelenskyy and Putin, who issued demands that were deemed unacceptable by Ukraine and its allies. Following this, Orbán's visit to Moscow elicited a wave of condemnation from European leaders. Many viewed his actions as undermining the EU's united front against Russian aggression and questioned his authority to engage in such high-level diplomacy without a clear mandate from the EU. European Council President Charles Michel and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen were among the prominent figures to criticize Orbán's visit to Moscow. They emphasized that as the holder of the EU's rotating presidency, Orbán lacked the mandate to negotiate with Russia on behalf of the EU. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas also voiced strong objections, asserting that Orbán does not represent the EU or its positions in Moscow. These criticisms underscore a broader concern within the EU about Orbán's perceived pro-Russian stance and the potential implications for European unity. Orbán's diplomatic maneuvers come at a critical juncture. The EU has been striving to maintain a unified stance in support of Ukraine amidst the ongoing conflict, which has seen significant loss of life and widespread destruction. Orbán's actions, seen by many as an attempt to position himself as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, have raised alarms about the possible erosion of this unity. His suggestion of a ceasefire, while ostensibly a call for peace, is viewed by critics as aligning with Russian narratives and potentially weakening the EU's collective efforts to support Ukraine. The Hungarian Prime Minister's spokesperson was quick to clarify that Orbán's visit to Kiev was conducted on his behalf and not as a representative of the EU Council. However, this did little to assuage concerns among European leaders, who fear that Orbán's engagements with Putin could further strain relations within the EU. The timing and nature of Orbán's visits have heightened suspicions about Hungary's stance on the Ukraine conflict and its alignment with broader EU policies. Orbán's diplomatic activities must be viewed against the backdrop of Hungary's controversial position within the EU. He has been an outspoken critic of Western military aid to Ukraine, diverging sharply from the consensus among other EU and NATO members. His reluctance to provide arms to Ukraine and his persistent attempts to maintain close ties with Russia have drawn significant criticism. European leaders argue that Orbán's actions, including his recent visits, exploit the EU presidency position to sow confusion and potentially undermine the bloc's unified response to Russian aggression. The Hungarian Prime Minister's stance has not only isolated him from his European counterparts, but also raised questions about the implications for Hungary's role in the EU. By engaging directly with Putin, Orbán risks reinforcing perceptions that Hungary is not fully aligned with EU policies on Ukraine. This could have broader consequences for EU cohesion, particularly as the bloc navigates the complexities of supporting Ukraine while managing its internal dynamics. The controversy surrounding Orbán's visits is emblematic of the broader challenges facing the EU in maintaining a cohesive strategy towards the Ukraine conflict. As European leaders continue to emphasize the importance of unity and a firm stance against Russian aggression, Orbán's actions serve as a reminder of the delicate balancing act required to navigate differing national interests within the EU. His attempt to position himself as a mediator in the crisis highlights the complexities of intra-EU diplomacy and the potential pitfalls of divergent approaches. In response to the criticism, Orbán has defended his visits as necessary steps to foster dialogue and seek a resolution to the conflict. He argues that open channels of communication with both Kiev and Moscow are essential for any meaningful progress toward peace. This perspective is not widely shared within the EU, where there is a strong consensus that maintaining pressure on Russia through sanctions and support for Ukraine is the most effective strategy. The unfolding drama of Orbán's diplomatic forays underscores the intricate dynamics at play in European geopolitics. His actions have spotlighted the tensions within the EU and raised critical questions about the bloc's ability to present a united front in the face of external threats. As the conflict in Ukraine continues to evolve, the EU's response will be shaped not only by its collective policies but also by the actions of individual member states and their leaders. Now let's dive deeper into the background and implications of these events. The question of whether Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is a puppet of Russian President Vladimir Putin is a matter of significant debate and controversy, touching on issues of energy dependence, political isolation, and national sovereignty. To fully grasp the intricacies of this claim, we need to delve deeply into the arguments on both sides, examine Hungary's geopolitical and economic positioning, and understand the broader implications of Orbán's policies. Orbán's critics, particularly Hungarian opposition parties, frequently label him as Putin's puppet, arguing that his policies consistently favor Russian interests over those of the European Union. This perception is bolstered by several key factors. Firstly, Orbán's frequent meetings with Putin and discussions on energy supplies have raised suspicions. For instance, during a visit to Moscow, Orbán discussed energy supplies with Putin, leading opposition leaders to assert that Orbán's actions align more with Russian interests than with European values. These meetings are often highlighted as evidence of Orbán's preferential treatment towards Russia. Energy dependence is another critical factor underpinning these accusations. Hungary's substantial reliance on Russian energy is seen by critics as a strategic vulnerability that compromises Hungary's sovereignty and aligns its interests more closely with Russia. This dependence is particularly evident in Hungary's reluctance to fully support EU sanctions against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. For instance, despite the EU's collective stance on sanctioning Russia, Orbán has often sought exemptions or delays, undermining the unified European approach and reinforcing the narrative that his actions serve Russian interests. Orbán's stance on Russia has also led to political isolation within the EU. While other Central European leaders have shown strong support for Ukraine, Orbán has been criticized for his more conciliatory approach towards Russia, further fueling the perception that he is acting in Putin's interests. This isolation is not just political but also ideological, as Orbán's rhetoric often echoes sentiments that align more closely with Russian narratives than with European solidarity. In contrast to these criticisms, Orbán himself has vehemently denied any undue influence from Putin, dismissing such allegations as fake news. He maintains that Hungary's policies are based on national interests and sovereignty, rather than external influence. Orbán's supporters argue that his actions are pragmatic responses to Hungary's unique geopolitical and economic circumstances, rather than evidence of subservience to Russian interests. Despite the criticisms, Hungary has officially aligned with the West on several significant occasions. For instance, Hungary has voted for EU sanctions against Russia and supported United Nations resolutions condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. These actions demonstrate that Hungary, under Orbán's leadership, does participate in collective Western measures against Russia, contradicting the notion that Orbán is merely a puppet of Putin. To understand the full picture, we must also consider the economic benefits Hungary receives from its relationship with Russia. Hungary continues to purchase large amounts of Russian oil and gas, with imports valued at $343 million in January 2024 alone, making it Russia's biggest energy customer in the EU. This energy relationship is critical for Hungary's economy, providing stability and meeting the country's energy needs. Additionally, Hungary has struck new preferential deals to boost energy supplies from Russia, including building a new pipeline to take Russian oil products into Serbia. Such deals are often highlighted by Orbán's administration as necessary for Hungary's economic stability and energy security. Moreover, Russia is constructing the new PAX-2 nuclear power plant in Hungary, a major infrastructure project that promises long-term energy benefits. Furthermore, Hungary has recently agreed with Russia's Gazprom to defer winter gas payments, alleviating short-term budgetary pressures. This agreement underscores the practical economic considerations that influence Hungary's energy policies. However, these economic benefits come with significant caveats. Critics argue that Hungary's energy dependence on Russia compromises its sovereignty and aligns its interests more closely with Russia than with the EU. There are also concerns about the long-term economic benefits, as Hungary reportedly does not receive discounted gas prices from Gazprom despite its increased dependence. This dependency makes Hungary vulnerable to supply disruptions and geopolitical pressures from Russia, posing significant risks to national security. Moreover, continued reliance on Russian fossil fuels could slow down Hungary's transition to more sustainable and diverse energy sources, potentially putting it at a disadvantage as other countries move towards greener energy solutions. The physical infrastructure and geographical situation make it challenging for Hungary to quickly diversify its energy sources, further entrenching its dependence on Russian energy. Specific policies and actions by Orbán have led to accusations that he is influenced by Putin. These include Hungary's continued purchase of large amounts of Russian oil and gas, preferential energy deals, and the construction of the PAX-2 nuclear power plant by Russia. Orbán's opposition to certain EU sanctions and his diplomatic stance, including visits to Moscow without EU coordination, have also drawn criticism. His rhetoric and ideological stance, such as his 2014 speech citing Russia as a good example of Hungary's transformation into an illiberal democracy, further fuel these accusations. One particularly controversial move was Orbán's government's decision to allow the Russian majority-owned International Investment Bank to move its headquarters from Moscow to Budapest in 2019. Critics describe this as Putin's Trojan horse, seeing it as a symbol of Orbán's willingness to accommodate Russian interests within Hungary. If Hungary remains heavily dependent on Russian energy, it could face several potential consequences. Politically, this dependence could lead to further isolation within the EU, as Hungary's stance on Russian energy has already caused rifts with its allies, particularly Poland. Economically, Hungary's high dependence on Russian gas and oil makes it extremely vulnerable to supply disruptions or price fluctuations, putting great strain on public finances. Moreover, continued reliance on Russian energy could delay Hungary's energy transition, potentially putting it at a disadvantage in the long term as other countries move towards greener energy solutions. This dependence also gives Russia significant geopolitical leverage over Hungary, potentially influencing its political decisions and foreign policy stance. The characterization of Viktor Orbán as Putin's puppet is driven primarily by his critics and opposition parties, who point to his close ties with Russia and policies that appear to favor Russian interests. However, Orbán and his supporters reject this label, arguing that Hungary's actions are based on national interests and sovereignty. The debate reflects broader geopolitical tensions within the EU and between the West and Russia. Hungary's economic relationship with Russia, particularly its energy dependence, adds a layer of complexity to this issue, highlighting the practical considerations that influence Orbán's policies. The potential consequences of this dependence, including political isolation, economic vulnerability, and energy security risks, underscore the challenges Hungary faces in balancing its energy needs with its geopolitical and strategic interests. We appreciate your continued interest and support as we navigate these complex and ever-evolving stories from the heart of Europe. If you enjoyed this episode, Please consider subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with others keen to understand the intricacies of this significant conflict. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue to bring you the latest developments and in-depth analysis from Ukraine and beyond. Until then, this is Connor Bendix, signing off from Ukraine Echoes. Stay informed, stay engaged, and as always, keep listening.